In 1981, a young Apple engineer named Bud Tribble watched Steve Jobs walk into a room and tell his team they were shipping a product in 6 months. It was impossible. Everyone knew it. But something happened in that room. Engineers who had spent weeks explaining why it couldn't be done started believing it could. They went back to their desks. They worked nights. They skipped weekends. And they shipped it. Bud Tribble didn't call it leadership. He coined a term that would follow Steve Jobs for the rest of his life. He called it the Reality Distortion Field. And once you understand how it actually worked, you'll start seeing it everywhere. If you're still here, you already think differently than most people on this platform. Subscribe to Human Instincts. New Mind. Every week. The phrase comes from Star Trek, an alien race that could reshape reality through sheer will. Tribble borrowed it because nothing else fit. Here's the simple version. Steve Jobs had the ability to make people believe things that weren't true, not through deception exactly, but through a complete and total rejection of the word impossible. When engineers told him a deadline couldn't move, he didn't negotiate. He acted like the constraint didn't exist. And the constraint would bend. Psychologists describe this as cognitive reframing at scale. Jobs wasn't lying. He genuinely believed what he was saying. And that genuine belief, that absolute, unshakable certainty, is what made it contagious. You cannot fake the reality distortion field. That's what made it so dangerous. Steve Jobs was abandoned as a baby. His biological parents gave him up days after he was born. He spent his entire childhood knowing this, and rather than breaking him, it forged something in him. A refusal to let any external force define what was possible. He dropped out of college and slept on floors. He traveled to India looking for something he couldn't name. He sat in on calligraphy classes just because they interested him, classes that would later shape every font in the original Macintosh. Jobs built his worldview from scratch. And in that worldview, constraints were not facts. They were opinions. That single distinction, a constraint as a fact versus a constraint as an opinion, is the foundation of everything that followed. The reality distortion field wasn't magic. It ran on 5 specific psychological levers. Certainty. Jobs never hedged. No, I think, no, maybe, no, we're hoping. He stated things as established truth. The human brain treats certainty as a signal of competence. When someone speaks without doubt, we instinctively defer. Reframing. When someone said something was impossible, Jobs didn't argue on their terms. He changed the question. Instead of "can we do this?" it became "what kind of people are we?" Nobody wanted to be the ones who said no. The stare. People who met Jobs described his eye contact as physically uncomfortable. Unblinking. Fully present. He would hold it until you caved or matched his energy. Most caved. Selective reality. Jobs was extraordinary at isolating everything positive and amplifying it, while treating anything negative as irrelevant noise. He wasn't lying. He was curating. And the version of reality he presented was always the most compelling possible one. Binary thinking. For Jobs, everything was either the greatest thing ever made, or garbage. No middle ground. This forced everyone around him to constantly hit the highest bar, because landing in the second category was devastating. 5 levers. 1 outcome. The room bends. Here's the part most people skip. The same force that built the Macintosh made Steve Jobs one of the most difficult human beings in Silicon Valley history. Engineers would have breakthroughs. Jobs would present them as his own ideas. Employees would spend months on a project. He'd walk in, call it garbage in 30 seconds, and leave. He parked in a handicapped spot every single day, not out of carelessness, but because parking rules simply didn't apply to the reality he lived in. His daughter Lisa, whose existence he denied for years, grew up largely without a father. Because in Jobs' version of reality, he had decided he wasn't the father. And he made himself believe it. Andy Hertzfeld, one of the original Mac engineers, described it as a confounding mix of charismatic rhetoric, indomitable will, and an eagerness to bend any fact to fit the purpose at hand. Same tool. Completely different outcomes depending on what it was pointed at. You want the most undeniable proof that the reality distortion field was real? The products. Every time Jobs declared something impossible and his team did it anyway, the result wasn't just good enough. It was category-defining. The Mac. The iPod. The iPhone. The iPad. Each one required engineers to solve problems they had previously told Jobs were unsolvable. Each one changed the world. There's a version of history where Apple's engineers held their ground, stayed rational, and shipped something reasonable. In that version, the smartphone revolution probably still happens, just not in 2007, and not in a black rectangle that felt like holding the future. The reality distortion field didn't just motivate people. It produced better outcomes than logic alone would have allowed. That is the most uncomfortable truth about Steve Jobs. The manipulation worked. If you're still here, you already think differently than most people on this platform. Hit subscribe, because every week we break down the psychology behind the people who actually shaped the world.